After the vet was done doing the ultrasound, she wasn't sure what she was looking at. The vet was a little confused herself, looking at the results again, just to be sure she wasn't making a mistake. But the numbers stayed the same, meaning she was right. Throughout all her years working as a vet, she hasn't seen anything quite like this. What she did know was that time is of the essence, and she had to act quickly in order to help the dog in her care. Chris and Marisa were looking to adopt a dog, which is why they visited a number of shelters to look for the right addition to their family. Marisa promised she'd pick only one, but it was proving hard to pick a single dog when there was an abundance of sweethearts wherever they went. They all looked at this prospective mother with bleeding eyes that told her how much they wanted to be adopted. Despite this, she was able to find the one as her eyes landed on this particular dog. The one that approached him and started to lick their hands was a heavily pregnant pooch. Her belly was swelling with unborn pups, and Marisa could tell this dog deserved to go to a proper home. The pit bull deserved to give birth to her babies in a loving place. There was no doubt in her mind that this was the dog they were going to bring home with them. However, they soon learned a thing that made them reconsider whether they were making the right choice. What was it? Who would have thought that this expecting pit bull had an even sadder story? Marisa felt like crying for the poor dog, who she learned was called Story. The pooch used to belong to a person who had backyard breeding business. When her owner realized how expensive and hard it was to take care of Story and the puppies, they took her to the shelter instead. Chris and Marisa wanted to make things right for the dog. They wanted to shower Story with love and affection, as well as give her a shelter. It was hard enough to carry pups and then deliver them. A shelter was no place for a pregnant dog. However, things got even more complicated when they saw a vet. The Lovebirds happened to be huge fans of pit bulls. In fact, Chris and Marisa have already rescued a number of dogs from this breed. Want to give us a specific number? You'll be delighted to hear they have 10 fur babies. Here, you can see 8 of their cute dogs. When you have dogs, you also need to ensure that you have enough beds to rest them in. Here is their so-called mega bed. When Chris talked to Today, he said, "At nighttime, all the dogs want to sleep on the bed, and sometimes it becomes too cluttered, and we end up being pushed off the bed or sleeping on the couch. So we built the mega bed." Isn't it incredible? It measures 7 feet wide and 14 feet long. This space is important for the rescues they chose to adopt. Chris and Marisa later arrived at the conclusion there was still more they could do for these dogs. As you can see, the two of them are truly smitten with pit bulls. Although they had plenty of dog-parent experience under their belts, this situation was something they'd never encountered before. Well, no one saw it coming. The couple shared one passion, and it was none other than their love for animals. In one interview, Marisa even went on to say she broke up with her partners in the past because they didn't understand her obsession with dogs. A lot of her former significant others didn't support her vision of filling a home with puppies. It was a good thing that she met a fellow dog lover in Chris. Apart from the fact that they loved each other, they also had a mutual love of dogs. Together, this passion only grew the more they spent time together. Here's proof of how much they love their fur babies. A lot of rescue centers and animal shelters deal with problems that go beyond their resources. This is the reason they can't possibly care for all the animals they want to rescue, no matter how much the staff want to. When Chris and Marisa went to the pit bulls and more animal rescue, they noticed that there was one particular breed of dogs that was present in overwhelming numbers: pit bulls. They had a hard time believing these friendly dogs didn't have a loving home to call their own. The Lovebirds didn't know it then, but one of these creatures would change their lives. Pit bulls have received a terrible reputation, although this is nothing more than one big misunderstanding. You see, the features of this dog breed would be a large head and muscular physique, though this isn't indicative of the risks they pose. Even though this is the case, a lot of states have deemed it illegal to have a pit bull as a pet. It's the reason many animal shelters take care of so many pit bulls. Chris and Marisa were both aware this is the case, which is why they took in as many pit bulls as their resources allowed. They never witnessed any violence from their pets whatsoever. This only made them want to help the lovely dogs more, though they didn't have a clue what fate was planning for them. Even though pit bulls are thought to be the most dangerous breed of dog out there, no research has actually come up with findings to support that. The truth is, they can be loving and loyal like any other dog breed. Of course, they might behave badly when mistreated. However, this doesn't mean they're predisposed to act like terrible creatures. These dogs are actually amazing creatures when you give them a chance. At the shelter, one special pit bull was going to prove everyone wrong. The staff at the center informed Marisa and Chris that it was high time for Story to deliver the puppies. In fact, she should have given birth by then. They didn't know why it hadn't happened yet, since the dog looked ready to pop. What a precarious situation. What was going on? This animal-loving couple knew right away this meant trouble for the poor pit bull. She needed help as soon as possible. They had to make the decision on the spot, since it could make the difference between life and death for the dog and her unborn puppies. Time was of the essence. Story needed to be taken care of right then, but the couple had to think it over some more. When they were talking to each other, Story rested her beautiful face on her prospective human's knee and pleaded with her eyes. Marisa came to a decision. She knew she would be bringing Story home, but was this the right choice? After all, this meant the family would get one more member bigger, if not more. This was going to be a big challenge, that's for sure. However, they'd soon learn things were more complex than they seemed. Even though they were aware that keeping Story would mean taking care of an additional 10 dogs, they didn't want the pregnant dog mama to be at the shelter for longer than she needed to. Marisa wanted to help Story and give her a safe space to deliver the pups. The couple started to talk about it and weighed the pros and cons. Without a doubt, it wasn't a practical idea, but Chris suggested something that made perfect sense for the situation. It sure seemed like the best bet, both for their family and for Story and the pups. He suggested they foster Story and her puppies, but this was only going to be temporary, as the animal rescue team would then look for forever homes. This was a good idea, since they couldn't afford to keep more pets with their 8 other dogs. The suggestion was a brilliant one, but the problems didn't end there. They still had to find out what was wrong with the pregnancy. What was the reason Story hadn't yet given birth, even though she was bursting? This was the next thing they had to tackle. They needed to give the pregnancy the attention it deserved. This was the first time they've ever encountered anything like this. There must be some reason Story was unable or unwilling to give birth to the babies. Chris and Marisa had been worrying about it, so they decided to go to the internet and look for a way to address the issue. Did they find anything of relevance? Unfortunately, they didn't find a lot of reassuring things online. In fact, they came out even more worried. Well, this is what normally happens when you look for answers online. Chris and Marisa felt even more anxious. Humans have a tendency to underestimate just how intelligent most animals actually are. When Marisa and Chris started to look for answers, they found out why a dog might resist a delivery. They even found a source that seemed to perfectly describe what was happening. What did they learn? Research showed that animals often experience a lot of stress and even trauma when they live in rescue shelters. Of course, pregnant dogs are more vulnerable to this. While shelters have the intention of helping animals in need, they get crowded quickly. A crowded place is not the best environment for a pregnant dog, and loving homes such as Chris and Marisa's can make a big difference. Chris and Marisa started to read up about the matter some more and realized things could escalate further. There was a possibility Story would lose her puppies. Not only that, but she might also lose her life. They certainly had no idea how bad things were. Can you believe that's not all either? Marisa found out that pregnant dogs experiencing trauma get so worried about the pups they could choose to refuse delivery. This situation happened since they were under the impression the babies would be at risk. Chris and Marisa were able to tell this was a dangerous situation. They had to bring the pregnant pooch to the vet as soon as they could. This was important if they wanted to ensure the safety. They popped back in the car and drove to the nearest vet. The vet conducted an ultrasound scan on the dog but saw unbelievable results. She shook her head. How could this even be possible? There must have been some kind of mistake, one way or another. However, nothing about the results changed or disappeared, not the shapes or the numbers. It was true. What she saw there could change things for the couple and others involved. Marisa picked up on the fact something wasn't right. What was it now? The veterinarian took a deep breath before delivering the news. She went into an explanation of the abnormality she found in Story's womb. They had been expecting to see 6 puppies, but this didn't line with the ultrasound results. The vet pointed to the outlines and then counted them for the couple. Chris and Marisa then figured out what was happening, and they were in shock. They were told Story would have 6 puppies, but the ultrasound revealed this wasn't true. What was going on? The vet didn't expect it either. She tried to count again and again and again. The results were always the same. At last, she figured out there was no choice but to tell them. Chris and Marissa had been expecting 6 puppies, but the vet knew this was wrong. The pregnant dog wasn't carrying 6 puppies but 12, twice the number of dogs they were expecting. At any rate, Story had 12 puppies in her womb. How are they going to solve this mess? The lovebirds couldn't believe what they just heard. How could this happen? 6 dogs already sound like too much, but 12? Clearly, the problem was even more serious than they originally thought. Was Story going to be okay? Was she going to deliver all 12 of her babies? Let's find out. Even the vet had no idea why Story had yet to give birth to her large litter of puppies. At the very least, the ultrasound showed her that the puppies were all fine. What a relief. What was next for them? The vet said that the best thing they could do was head home and get ready for the birth. If Story still hadn't given birth after 48 hours, they should return for yet another examination. Chris and Marissa didn't know it at the time, but Story actually had a great reason to wait. You can probably imagine how stressed the couple was at that moment. Story was not only in danger of losing 6 babies, but a dozen. They couldn't help but feel anxious about the following 48 hours. Was Story going to be all right if she failed to deliver the pups in that time frame? It's easy to see this was a dangerous and terrible situation, but there seemed to be nothing else they could do. The only thing left was to make her feel at home. When they went home, Marissa came up with a clever plan. By that point, Chris and Marissa already went through a lot of articles about trauma and stress. They knew how hard things have been on Story. They tried to help her by giving her a very inviting space. Marissa chose a spot in a spare bedroom, even placing pillows and blankets. After that, they showed Story her new sanctuary and prayed for the best. Chris and Marissa gave it their all because they wanted to make it just right for the pooch. They even kept track of the room temperature and noise level. The couple didn't know that something incredible was going to happen there. The 2 of them headed off to bed for the night and went to see how Story was doing on waking up. They wanted to see if she was feeling better and comfortable. As Marissa and Chris headed to the room where they left the pit bull, they could hear some curious noises. They hurried and entered, and didn't expect what they were laying their eyes on. They entered the spare bedroom. Much to their delight, they found Story in there with her 12 adorable puppies. She was able to deliver them all while the 2 of them slept. What an incredible sight it was. Marissa and Chris were reduced to tears by what they saw. Who'd have thought Story was finally going to deliver the pups? They were thrilled. Soon enough, they learned just why she waited so long. When dogs give birth to puppies at the shelter, it often becomes stressful for both the mom and babies. Story was somehow aware that the shelter wasn't a good place for anyone to give birth in an environment like that one. This is the reason she decided to wait for someone like Chris and Marissa. Isn't it incredible that Story only had to spend 1 whole day, even less, with Chris and Marissa to feel comfortable around them? She was so at home she even delivered her litter of puppies. What made it even more special was the fact that no one understood what was going on. Good job, Story. Story was great when it came to looking after the puppies. What else did you expect from the best dog mother in the entire world? It didn't take long before people started to file adoption cases for the pups. The couple already knew they wouldn't get to keep the puppies. But was Story going to be okay with letting the puppies go? After several weeks, the puppies finally opened their eyes. Marissa and Chris had been enjoying the time they had with the litter of puppies. The babies took over the yard and goofed around with one another. You know what they're like? Story was happy to have all of her pups with her. Sadly, though, time came to say goodbye. When Story was taken to a good and secure environment, she was able to let her body do the work and deliver the puppies. This was how she got to welcome all 12 of them. However, what was next for her and the babies? Let's find out. Seems like Story knew just what she needed to give birth. It's impressive to hear that they managed to find foster parents willing to adopt the puppies when they were 10 weeks old. Chris and Marissa might have adored the babies, but they simply didn't have the means to keep them. They had to give them up for adoption. It was a heartbreaking moment, but the right thing to do. When they were 10 weeks old, the puppies were brought to their new homes. We're glad to hear that, but what would become of Story? The puppies were all in good hands now, but what about their mother? After risking her life for her children, this wonderful mother deserves only the best. It's not at all surprising to hear the story went viral when it was posted on Facebook. The inspiring story of Story reached someone who fell in love with her right away. This man then contacted Chris and Marissa to schedule an appointment. He wanted to meet this dog and then see from there. What did he have to say? He ended up loving Story even more and decided to take her with him. Story has, at long last, made her way to a forever home. She and the rest of the puppies were taken to their amazing homes. And not only that, but she also got spayed to prevent any more massive pregnancies. Let's hope she never has to go through anything like that again. Even though Story gave birth to a large number of puppies, she still remembered to give them the attention and love they deserved. When she was still with them, she was the image of a perfect mom. Aren't you excited to hear something so nice? Chris and Marissa were both happy and proud to see Story accomplish such a big feat. She even cleaned and nursed the puppies while she waited for them to reach a good health. Sadly, the couple didn't have much more time with them. The 12 pups all went to forever homes. They're glad this is the case because they'll never run out of love and affection now. Story stayed with Chris and Marissa until each of the puppies were taken. Her maternal instincts are still bright as they can be. If Marissa and Chris failed to take a chance on her, some very terrible things could have happened to her and the babies. We're happy they took a chance on the incredibly pregnant dog they found in the crowded animal shelter. Otherwise, things would have gotten a much sadder ending. Woo! Even though the story of Story had a happily ever after, there are so many dogs out there who will never find a forever home. Shelters typically need plenty of help to take good care of the animals. If you're unable to foster a dog for some reason, you can do more by checking out your other options. Of course, it's always a good idea to take in a new dog if you can, but you can opt to donate money or spread the word about the shelter or rescue home. These might sound like little things, but they go a long way to help the people who work there. Marissa and Chris are the founders of a nonprofit organization that looks after elderly and sick dogs called the Mr. Mo Project. The dogs that fall under these categories have a high risk of euthanasia, so the couple wants to look for places they could call their forever homes. The project also takes care of medical and living expenses. The Fospice homes, meanwhile, provide care and love. If you can adopt or foster dogs, you should always keep this story in mind. There's no need to fret if you don't think you have enough bed space for all the dogs you want to adopt. Should that ever happen, try to follow in the footsteps of Marissa and Chris. Although the average king bed measures 6.6 feet long, theirs is nearly double that. This is an option you might want to consider. By this point, you should know better than anyone how much Marissa and Chris love dogs. You can even check out their Instagram account, the Mr. Mo Project. On that account, they posted this photo with a caption that read, "Happy Easter and Passover, from our doghouse to yours."